That was an excellent presentation. Dr. Gidry thought it'd be better to split this topic up because it can involve several components that seem to be all moving at once. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the notion of how do we construct or things that should be included in just general farm leases. Oftentimes as producers, you know, producers are faced with a lot of different risks out there: market risk, weather risk, production risk. But you know, a well-written and well thought out farm lease is one way that growers can address this legal risk. And since a lease is both a contract as well as a conveyance in an interest in real property, we're essentially combining real estate and contract law into one. And oral leases are valid in Louisiana, but written leases are going to be preferable because it's going to provide that written evidence of the lease terms that can really assist not only the grower but also the landlord in terms of how these valuations, how these disruptions to the sugarcane crop cycle can be addressed. And I think one thing to stress is a lease is something that should be revisited. We talked about how sugarcane was a multi-year crop that's got multi-year impacts to all parties involved. So it's really a vehicle of open communication, and it really should be kind of a long-term kind of planning tool that are addressing the needs of not only the grower but all parties involved. And I'm not going to get into these, but when you look at the lease provisions out there, length and rent and termination clauses and the types of crops we're growing, farming practices, attorney fees, etc. So these things are really limitless in what could go into one. But the bottom line is that they should be able to meet the needs of both parties involved. But I think, and I'll talk about this in a minute, specifically some of these terms and some of these provisions that pertain specifically to sugarcane production and make the distinction that sugarcane is a perennial crop, it is a multi-year crop, and it can have multi-year impacts to income streams of both parties. And we're going to talk about ways that we can really address some of these provisions as they pertain to sugarcane production. But Dr. Gidry alluded to this earlier. There's several advantages to having a written lease. Number one, it's going to be clear. It's going to give you a record of what was agreed to by the both parties. There's protection in there, but also when we talk about assignees and heirs in a case where maybe one party is unfortunately passed away or the farm is sold. And, a lot of times with crop leases, not only sugarcane, but, in other crops as well, oftentimes you may be dealing with sons or daughters of a property owner. Absentee landowners are a big part of this, people that don't understand agriculture. So you can put some things in a lease to address that. Different phases of the lease with planting or harvesting or compensation and things like that. But specific to sugarcane, the written leases compensate unrecovered expenses. Provisions to harvest maybe a current year if that stubble is going to be sold to, say, a non-agricultural use like a real estate development. How do we define unrealized future net revenue? These are big, important pieces of sugarcane that can be put in a lease so that we can, again, revert back to that first bullet point, a clear, indisputable record of what was originally agreed to. Dr. Gidry mentioned this, just, the generic types of leases, cashes or share rent. But one thing I do want to point out is that, when we talk about the notion of share rents, the landowners is going to share in production risk versus a cash rent mechanism. That comes into play with some farm bill programs for commodity production. But oftentimes, one thing, the single year term or the multi-year term, what are we trying to address for the purposes of what crops are being produced on the farm? When you dive into the Louisiana Civil Code, everybody knows we do things a little differently in Louisiana. There's a plethora of different Civil Code articles that are applicable to farm leases. I put some of these here on a table. I'm not going to go into any of them in great detail. We do hopefully have a report forthcoming that can address some of these as they pertain to agriculture. But we talked, the Civil Code does govern things like rent, agreement, termination, things like that. But shifting now to specifically talk about sugarcane production and really the differences that exist with cane and the differences that should be included in that written farm lease. Sugarcane is a perennial crop. We have to consider the extended seed cane expansion phases that are a function of those prorated costs. Compared to other crops, sugarcane is a highly managed crop. It's got a high degree of management intensity, and the production cost and planting costs are very substantial on a per acre basis that are incurred by the grower. There's a real threat from cropland sold for development purposes, especially in urban centers. Lafayette, for instance, would be a good example of that. But if the land were to be sold at a point within the crop cycle, how would compensation be dispensed? What compensation would that grower be entitled to? Do things like planting costs, cultivation costs, future gross, future net revenue, some combination. How is that compensation going to be addressed? And through that clear, concise of language in a lease, that can actually spell the terms out that the parties can agree to. Dr. Selassie and I did a study, and this was 2009, which was a long time ago, but in the survey, we were trying to solicit lease numbers, oral or written. And I thought it was interesting. I dug up some of this data, and I think at the time we had survey results. We did this over all crops. About 30% of the total sugarcane planted acres were included in the survey. So we had producers respond on about 125,000 acres of sugarcane, and a majority of the reported survey responses did utilize written agreements. 29% of the acres were oral, but almost 58% of the contracts of the oral leases were multi-year arrangements, compared with 70% of the written leases being for more than 1 year. So I think this notion that sugarcane being addressed on a multi-year basis is being addressed. That these oral leases are considered binding under Louisiana law, but just again, how important that written lease is to a producer, because everybody is going to define the term value differently. Right? How is value defined? Does it only refer to the current crop in the field? Are we talking about total crop value to just the grower? How do we adequately address for mill and landlord shares? What about the succeeding years of production? Years of stubble that are left on the remaining crop cycle? What happens with a change of tenant? So again, when we start to define the value of a crop, it's important that this lease language and this terminology get into specific details on methodologies, procedures, and really even defining these terms themselves. Especially when the crop is sold for non-ag uses like a real estate development. What happens if a pipeline comes in? We've addressed this a little bit. Does the current condition of the crop matter? Again, we assume that there's a certain level of management intensity that's performed in these crops. How is value determined? Past prices, recent production histories of the farm, based on conversation with industry experts or LSU Ad Center personnel. So these questions can be answered and can be specified in a well-crafted lease arrangement. And Dr. Guidry's already alluded to some of this about sugarcane yields, acreage used for seed cane, future value. I won't go into that again. But here's just a scenario where a grower-to-grower transfer. We talked about if production continues on a field with a grower-to-grower transfer, then that current grower would receive those unrecovered planting costs and any current year production expenses. And those costs are planting or prorated based by the LSU Ad Center. Again, here's that snapshot of that table that Dr. Guidry referenced that we do publish every year. In August, I'll put a new report out for the upcoming planning year. But here's an example about how lease terminology and the value and the language can address how that notion of value associated with a grower transfer could read in a lease. Should this crop lease be terminated before the end of the current crop cycle and the sugarcane crop will remain in production with another tenant grower, the lessee should be paid the total sugarcane unrecovered planting costs applicable to the current sugarcane crop age right there. But also, it's important to define what that sugarcane crop cycle length is. And I'll talk about how important that may be here in the next couple slides. Scenario B, let's say sugarcane production is going to be terminated entirely. The land is going to be removed from agricultural production. Dr. Guidry talked about how our reports, would calculate a value on the higher of that net present value of the future net revenue or those unrecovered planning costs. But in certain situations, what happens if, say, a pipeline comes in, it destroys 1 acre of a 10-acre tract of plant cane? So given the production history of the tract, the grower's intended crop cycle was going to go through for stubble. Here, the net present value would be calculated for the value cycle, since that anticipated of that 1 acre would be lost. But however, the grower in this case maybe only had a farm lease. Maybe it's based on language that was maybe never changed, or maybe it was just agreed upon that a crop cycle was defined as harvest through third stubble only. So here compensation would be a little bit different. It wouldn't address the harvest through fourth stubble because of that written lease agreement was never updated. It was never changed to reflect the current production practices on the farm. Another example here, suppose a real estate developer comes in, he buys the entire 10 acres of plant cane, farm lease is terminated, then that lease should be explicit in how value is defined. In this case, when that sugarcane goes to a non-agricultural land use, terminology, should this crop lease be terminated and the production is terminated before the crop cycle, then we get into that net present value to the lessee. But future net returns will be estimated on all acres currently in production. But remember, if that lease wasn't updated to reflect these longer production cycles, it can be problematic for the grower in receiving adequate compensation. And here's just a different, just a little table I put together. I'll draw your attention to that orange one at the bottom right there, with the lease language for value and how value was defined in a lease. If it was the unrecovered planning cost, if it was the future for the current stage only, if it was future net revenues for the entire crop cycle with older lease language through third stubble, or maybe they update this document every other year it's updated, what have you, you could see the differences that are going to be attributed to how we're defining value and value's place in that farm lease when it comes time to economic compensation for that. Again, with the popular variety 299, older stubble is kept in production. Again, I won't go through some of those numbers, but the difference that value is defined in that lease, how it's defined, what it represents, can produce a different level of revenue toward that grower. Here's an example of some of that lease terminology now. If that crop lease is terminated before the end of the crop cycle and the sugarcane production is terminated, the grower should be paid the net present value of estimated future net revenue above variable cultivation and harvested costs that are attributed to the grower through the end of the operation's normal crop cycle, and i.e. through the acceptable number of stubble crops, which would be needed to be defined in a crop lease. I know that was a lot. I know that was a lot of information there. But I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody would have from the presentation.